So we're going to get started again. I hope you were all able to get some lunch from one of the places on campus. We're just changing this next section very, very slightly. So we're going to have Isla Dixon come and talk to us. We're then going to have around 10 minutes questions and answers for Isla because Mick and Josh aren't with us physically. So they've recorded talks for us to watch. So we'll have the Q&A directly after Isla's talk while it's all fresh in your minds, and then it might be that we finish 5 minutes earlier for a longer break before the final panel session. So Isla, are you okay to join us up at the front? So Isla's going to be talking to us about progress and the future of policing disability hate offences. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll be all right with that. Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Isla Dixon. I'm currently a diversity and inclusion officer at Leicestershire Police, but up until December last year, I was the Force Hate Crime Officer. So I've been working with David for a long time on being able to come and talk here, and obviously on behalf of the organisation I'll be able to talk about my experiences around dealing with disability hate and other hate. Our new hate crime officer is here with us, so obviously if there's anything that we can do at the end to help introduce her to some of you, she is here with us, but hopefully going through a little bit today. I wanted to start by talking about some of the challenges that we face. It's easy to talk about progress and what we've done and what we can do in the future, but actually what are some of the challenges that we as a police force face? Obviously, I'm talking on behalf of Leicestershire Police, but I'm sure that other police forces will say very similar things. One of the biggest things that I've always faced as a hate crime officer is, what do we mean by the term hate crime? It's very much misunderstood term. Because when people hear the word hate crime, they think we're talking about criminal offences. We've heard from people today already, and we're going to hear obviously from others beyond me, that hate incidents are probably the things that will impact people more than the crime itself. And how do we get people to understand that hate crime is an umbrella term used to talk about those criminal offences, but also those non-crime incidents, which actually leave that more lasting impact? Trust and confidence, I think it's been clear from what Neil put up this morning and what other colleagues have spoken about. Trust and confidence in our communities to come forward and speak to the police about what's happening to them is a big issue for us. We do a lot of work, and I've certainly done a lot around trying to build that trust and confidence. Another one's, and this is certainly pertinent to those with disability hate incidents, when they ring us and tell us that they've been targeted due to their disability, when they speak to our call handlers or our officers, when they meet them on the street, they're not actually that confident to say, I've been targeted because I have a disability. Clearly, people with physical disabilities, that's easy for those who are seeing them in person to determine. But when we're talking to them on the phone, do we know that? Not necessarily. So we need to build that trust and confidence of people to be able to tell us that the reason they've actually called us in the first place is because of that disability. Again, and this is one I'm particularly passionate about, is the work I do internally. So as a diversity and inclusion officer, that's something I'm really trying to drive, is the understanding of our officers and staff about disabilities when they're talking to people and recording those incidents and those crimes. Do they understand the courage it's taken for people to come forward and speak? Do they understand the challenges that those people might be facing in trying to report those incidents to us? Do they actually understand that people with disabilities, and I stand in front of you today, I have disabilities I don't declare, I don't talk about them because I'm embarrassed. So how do we encourage our officers and staff to understand that and build that trust and confidence to be able to get people to be confident to tell us? And then we've already heard a little bit from Neil earlier, the difference in national recording of crime. So disability hate doesn't hold the same weight within the criminal justice system as race and religion does, for example. So how do we encourage people to come forward and tell us about what's happening to them if they know, once we've done our bit and the CPS pick it up, that actually something may or may not get done about it? So how do we standardise that? And I know that there is some talk about that later on. So how then do I go from all those challenges and kind of talk about progress? What have we done? And I wanted to start by looking at how we've dealt with hate crime since 2016. which are where those national statistics are available. Obviously, I've started with the national picture because obviously the government produced this bit of data for us, and it is clear to show, Neil mentioned a little bit about it earlier on, but in graphic form, if you like, how hate crime has increased since 2016. You know, it's clear to see as we move up towards 20 and 21, that all of them, with the exception of religious hate crime, which Neil touched on earlier, are increasing. So we are clearly doing something right. And when I say we, I mean we as a community, not we as police, because obviously we rely on the reports to come in. I'm not sure why the national figures aren't coming up in there, but I just tried to show you it as a pyramid to be able to show how that looks over that period of time, so that you can see graphically how those things are changing and how we're making it. But what does that look like then for Leicestershire Police? We are clearly also doing something right, and I am proud to stand here before you as the former hate crime officer and now diversity and inclusion officer, because I've done a lot of work since I came into post to build confidence with our disability communities, to encourage them to come forward and tell us not just about the crime, but also about the incidents. So 2021-22, we've seen a significant increase in reporting. I'm not going to take all the credit for that because I think COVID played a big part in that. People being targeted around the non-mask wearing, the exemptions, people then being targeted, and I work with somebody who has a disability, didn't need to wear a mask, wore a mask and got targeted because she chose to wear a mask. What is society doing to make that happen? But equally, we also found that national pressure saw people coming forward to tell us because they wanted us to start to deal with those issues. So we've been able to see that increase. One of the other things I spoke about was the difficulty we have around crime recording. We don't break down disability hate in the same way as we do religious hate, organisationally, nationally. The Home Office don't ask us to do that. So we introduced something in Leicestershire Police where we will ask people who report to us what disability they have. So it helps us to determine on a local level those community groups that have been targeted. These are the top 4. And that is reliant on somebody telling us when they ring us up exactly what motivation is, if they have a disability, what that is. As you can see, unknown is by far the highest within that top 4. And that's either because we haven't asked those questions. So our officers, when they're investigating those crimes, are not asking those questions. They're not speaking to our victims and saying, well, can you tell me then? They're kind of just leaving it with, well, they said it was disability hate related and we're just going to look into it, but we're not going to dig deeper. Or our communities aren't feeling confident enough to tell us because they don't want to own up to it. They don't want to come forward and they're not comfortable saying that. But mental health, mobility issues and neurodiverse conditions are the ones that we're now starting to see. And that is part of the work we're trying to do, where we're linking in with our communities to say, please be open and honest with us. Please tell us. And in 2021, the ones that we did know about, these are some of those. And as you can see, there will be some of those already. We will go, but hang on a minute, that might be neurodiverse linked. That might be mental health linked. This just shows you the complexity of the issue that we face. When our officers are speaking to victims, everything that they record, our analysts then use a program that's able to pull those words out and be able to determine it. We now need to do a little bit more to try and make sure that we show those in the categories that they need to be in, but then also broken down within them. So lots and lots of work for us to do, but actually it's showing some of the progress we've made, because if you asked me to put that up for 2020 or before, I wouldn't have been able to do it because it didn't exist. So we've made some progress in how we're able now to define that and work then with our chief officer team to deal with some of those issues, to look at some of those complex issues and the hot spotting, so our analysts can hotspot where things are happening and we can use targeted policing to be able to support our communities better. And equally, we are now building stronger relationships across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland with our partners. Lots and lots of work to do. We know that. You know, I wouldn't stand here and be complacent to say we've got an amazing relationship across all of them, because there is always work to be done. But we do work really closely in partnership here across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland with our partners. You know, I can see in the audience, I've got people I know from across the health sector, from across the universities, you know, the councils, community groups. They're all here, and if we don't build on that, how do we continue to build on the successes we've already been able to see? So that, you know, the future for us is about making sure we build on the progress we've made already to continue that and sustain it, because saying we've made progress is one thing, sustaining that progress is something else. So for me, and I saw the graphic that's on there, when I was putting this together, I thought, how do I demonstrate what does the future look like? And actually, that epitomizes to me why I do the job I do, because it's only together that we can achieve more. In isolation and siloing, you know, I can stand here as passionate as I want to be, and I'm incredibly passionate about tackling hate. I can be as passionate as I want to be, but without other people supporting me and championing what I do and promoting what we do, that won't happen. So it's only through working together as a team that we're going to be able to do that. And for Leicestershire Police, that's about making sure we do that two-way conversation. There are community members in the audience with me today who will say that we do a good job with that. We do engage with our community. We do ask them for feedback, but we need to do more of that. We need to reach out, and Neil made mention it. They're not hard to reach. They're just those that we need to work that little bit harder to engage with. We know they're there. We've got people who can engage with us, who will have those links into them. So what more can we do to be able to do that? And there are different ways that we can do that. We need to raise more awareness. Clearly, we need to make our communities aware of what is hate crime. What is it that we do about it? What is it that we want you to tell us about? Because if we don't know, we can't deal with it. If we can build trust in our communities to come forward, so that if you tell us something's wrong and we do something, the you say we did is an amazing opportunity for us to build trust in our communities to actually come forward and talk to us. So we need to do that. And that's not only me standing from an office saying we need to do it. It's about embedding that culture within our staff, that when we're out and about, we're building trust and confidence in our communities to engage with us, talk to us, tell us about what's happening. Clearly, in time, that will build confidence. People will see Leicestershire Police as somewhere that they can go to, and this would be mirrored across all police forces, I'm sure. You know, if we can build the trust and we deliver on what we say we will build confidence in our communities to actually work more with us. We need to tackle that fear of stepping forward and telling us about what's happening. It's been mentioned, hate crime is one of the biggest things that I deal with, and I support lots of victims of hate. That fear of reprisal, that fear of it happening again, that fear of what happens if I stand up? Will my family disown me? Will my friends disown me? Am I going to be kicked out of my house? We need to deal with those fears and reassure our victims, but equally that they are treated with confidence. So when they come forward, we're not going to go and tell everybody that somebody from this community came and told us and it was this person, so we're naming and shaming them. That will help deal with that fear factor that people have, but equally making sure that when people come forward to us, we're giving them the support, not only us as an organisation, but our partner agencies, and that was mentioned this morning. What are we doing across partnerships to make sure that we are supporting victims of disability hate crime, working with our partners to find those solutions, not having those people fall through those cracks, because there is nothing worse than when you speak to somebody who says, 5 years ago, I tried to do this and I've still been waiting. It's soul destroying. And we need to do more to build that support network so people do know if it's not a policing matter, who should be dealing with it, who takes that primary control, because we can't fix everything. I really wish we could. Personally, I wish we could, but we can't. As a police force, we can't do it all, but we have partner agencies who can, support agencies that are available to be able to help those victims when they come forward. And I think lastly, for me, the biggest one, and it was touched on this morning, is stopping that normalising of what happens to people with disabilities. I stand in front of you and it happens to me regularly. Do I report every single incident I encounter? No, I don't, because I've normalised it. I've accepted that it's something that comes with the territory of having a disability, but we need to stop that. And I was talking through the lunch period. I am currently being targeted on social media for doing really positive work by people who find it negative. But unless I can get people to champion what I do in a positive way, what difference is that going to make? So what will happen is we normalise what we're doing because it's easier than dealing with the negative. But we need to stop that. And that leads to that bystander effect. You know, how many of us, when we see somebody in need of help, and I go into schools and talk about carrying our boxes around and, you know, our moral compasses and things like that, what do we do when we see that somebody needs help? And certainly I've heard stories from people who've spoken to me. They may be in a wheelchair, they may have a disability, and people are targeting them on the street, and people think it's okay to just keep on walking by. Somebody else will stop and deal with it. Somebody else is going to help them. They must have called for help. The police will be here in a minute. We all have a collective responsibility to help one another. So we need to build on, and that's not me, you know, as a diversity and inclusion officer or Leicestershire Police on its own. It's us as a collective community need to start working on tackling that bystander effect and making things work differently. So what are some of the things that we're doing at Leicestershire Police? Obviously, we work with non-governmental organisations. I go out and do a lot of community engagement, raising awareness around what hate crime is, raising awareness around discrimination, going into schools. I go into primary schools now. I'm being asked by primary schools to go in and talk about diversity and inclusion and language and how that leads to discrimination, because discrimination happens when we don't understand how to be inclusive. And that's across all protected characteristics. Continual feedback. We have to ask our communities what's wrong, what's right. We have to feed into them about the initiatives that we are doing. We have to share with them. We have to be transparent. Our internal workforce is continuously getting training. You know, we're delivering packages for them all the time across a wide spectrum of things. But diversity and inclusion, hate crime is really, really important, because if you don't understand it, how do you deal with it? And obviously, we do run independent advisory groups at Leicestershire Police. We always encourage our communities to join those, become that critical friend for us. We need you to be able to help drive that change, you know, challenge us on what we're doing. So we do have advisory groups, and we're always encouraging people to join that, because it's only that way that we will be able to make those changes in the future. Stamp It Out is the partnership approach to tackling hate in Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. It is a campaign that runs. These are the disability specific posters that we have, but we will have them across all the protected characteristics, trying to encourage people to come forward and report. Mechanisms to report. Yes, we know people are going online in a lot of ways. We still have 101, we still have 999, we still have police stations that are open. But this is just one other way that people can come forward and report incidents to us, because it's only with knowing what we don't know that we can make a change in the future, that we can progress how we can police disability hate crime. And thank you very much for listening to me. So, and I did it in time.
Thanks, Isla. Could just give Isla a round of applause. So the next talk that we've got is Mick Conboy, who's from the Crown Prosecution Service. I've been told by IT that if I click next again, it should automatically come up, and if not, I'm going to wave for help. So this is Mick Conboy. I have been told that Mick's online, so we might be able to get some kind of feedback from him, but I'm not making any promises. We'll see how that works.
Started. Hello everyone. We are pleased to welcome Mick Conboy, National Hate Crime Policy Lead for the CPS. Mick will talk about prosecuting disability hate crimes and overcoming difficulties. The presentation is recorded and will last about 15 minutes. If you have any questions, please contact Mick directly via email at mick.conboy@cps.gov.uk. I will now hand over to Mick.
Thank you very much, Irene. I'll get on with the slides, but can I first say that I was delighted to receive the invitation from the organisers of today's conference to speak about this really important topic. To start with, I thought I'd just give a little bit of context about who the Crown Prosecution Service is. We prosecute criminal cases investigated by the police in England and Wales. We make decisions independently of the police, courts and government. We bring charges in hate crime and advise police in early stages of the investigation of a crime. And we prepare cases and present them at court. And finally, we work closely with the police, the courts, the judiciary and other partners within the criminal justice system. We are guided in all this work we do by the Code for Crown Prosecutors, which is available to download online. And there are essentially two tests that we apply when using the code when deciding whether to charge or not. First of all, we have to be satisfied there is sufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect of conviction, and that is slightly lower than beyond a reasonable doubt, which is what the bar that the court uses. So a realistic prospect of conviction, and that the prosecution is in the public interest. Now, public interest has a lot of facets to it. But if there's no evidence supporting the charge, then the case doesn't proceed to this second test. The public interest test, though, includes a very interesting section. I'll read this out in full. It is more likely that prosecution is required if the offence was motivated by any form of prejudice against the victim's actual or presumed ethnic or national origin, gender, disability, age, religion or belief, sexual orientation or gender identity, or if the suspect targeted or exploited the victim or demonstrated hostility towards the victim based on any of those characteristics. So in a hate crime context, if you have the evidence that the crime is being committed, then the public interest will almost always be served by a prosecution if it's been flagged as a hate crime. So very important to remember that. Moving on in terms of our performance in recent years, so taking this back to 2016-17, roughly 5 years, and looked at some of the key indicators, convictions, guilty pleas and sentence uplifts. The conviction rate has been fairly steady, roughly around 80%. Which is not a bad outcome. In 80% of cases that come to us and we prosecute, then there's an 80%, an 8 in 10 chance that the prosecution will be successful. In terms of guilty pleas, it's increased slightly. We're up to 70% now. That means that the defence recommend to their clients that they put in a guilty plea to the charges. And that's usually because the case has been well put together, there's strong evidence, supporting argument, and the defence feel that there's no point resisting and going through the process of the trial. So that's improved slightly to 70% in this past 5 years. And the final section, sentence uplift, as you'll know, is when the court has the opportunity, if it accepts the evidence, accepts the argument, it is duty bound to apply a sentence uplift to the sentence. That means whatever the sentence was without the hostility will be increased or uplifted at the sentence. So it might be in terms of an increase of the fine, increase in terms of the length of time in prison. But that, as you can see, has gone up from just over roughly 15% up to just over 40% in the last 5 years. That's very positive, but for the biggest difficulty is that over this period of time we've seen a significant fall in the number of cases coming to us having been reported to the police. What comes through to us from the police is reduced by a significant number, which I can share at the end of the presentation as it's on my notes. Sorry about that, Irene. Do we need to start again?
No, we're okay.
Okay. In terms, obviously everything we do is geared by performance, directed by our performance, but we also do a lot of engagement with communities. We do a lot of research and a lot of conversations take place locally and nationally with disabled people's organisations on the issues around the experience and the impact of disability hate crime. In 2017-18, we revised our public policy statement on disability hate crime, and we put together a group to form a national scrutiny panel on disability hate crime, with people with lived experience of disability hate crime, DPOs, academics, people who could make a contribution to those fundamental questions. We then went out to a 3-month public consultation on that policy, and two of the major things that I think came out of all that work to engage around the revision to our policy statement was, first of all, the acknowledgement that in the criminal justice system in particular, we have a tendency to overuse the word vulnerable. And this is because vulnerable is seen as a category within various pieces of legislation that says this person is at risk, is perceived to be vulnerable, and is at risk of being targeted for criminal behaviours. That's something that we've taken on board, and we've encouraged prosecutors to look behind that label. It's a label, unfortunately, that's still written into legislation and the Victims Code and pieces of supporting guidance like that. But we're particularly keen to ensure that prosecutors don't fall into that way of thinking, that disability equals vulnerability. The person is something that is obviously much bigger than a label, and I think it's important for people to remember the individual in these instances. And the second significant addition to our thinking was the learning from the social model. In short, as you'll understand, and I'm sure this audience will appreciate, the social model is about identifying and removing barriers. I think there's a huge task still within the criminal justice system as a whole that we need to grapple with, how we identify and remove barriers for disabled victims and witnesses. Further support and engagement we've done over the last couple of years, we've mandated training for all prosecutors on disability hate crime. We have established a hate crime coordinators network so that each one of the 14 CPS areas has a specialist lead that can support and advise locally. Our inclusion community engagement managers are also busy engaging with communities at risk of hate crime, which includes disabled people. We've established in 2018, I think it was, a hate crime external consultative group, which again has representatives from DPOs, academics with a particular interest in disability, and is there essentially to give us a steer in terms of policy, practice and performance as to what we should be thinking about and how we should be approaching issues around disability hate crime. We've also introduced a new concept to our guidance for prosecutors called operational guidance, and this really does get into the detail of how hate crime occurs. So the language, the references, the behaviours that we need to be aware of. We want prosecutors to be aware of these things. We've not published it simply because we felt this was maybe too much of a tool for haters. If they see that there's guidance on the particular issues and words and language and references that people use when committing hate crime, it might actually have the opposite effect in the wrong hands. We've also undertaken a deep dive into disability hate crime files to see what learning we can draw from the experience of reviewing those cases once they've concluded. This again we did openly with DPOs and disabled people. We have, as a result of that, developed top tips for prosecutors when looking at disability hate crimes and identified the lessons arising from that deep dive that they all can learn from. We've also developed a prosecutor checklist, which is more of a top tips on things to look out for when you first open a file and you see it's a disability hate crime. In terms of next steps, very quickly, I'm sure everyone in the room will be aware of. We're all waiting to see what the government's response is to the Law Commission review. Very interested in some of the proposals there and the expansion of the definition to include prejudice. The government's hate crime strategy, which was has been promised, but obviously derailed slightly by the COVID pandemic. But we're expecting that to be coming out shortly, and that will give renewed focus and energy to the work we're all doing on disability hate crime. We are in the process of developing a toolkit for prosecutors in cases involving disabled people, which I've mentioned. One other key step we're going to introduce in September is the hate crime assurance live checks on live cases will return post-pandemic in September. So that will make a huge difference, where specialist prosecutors will be reviewing files that are flagged as disability hate crime in real time, so we're able to keep on top of any particular omissions or indeed any mistakes that have been made when the case can still be amended. And finally, we're looking to work increasingly since last October, when we published a joint statement with the MPCC. We're looking to work locally with the police to make sure that issues of concern to communities at local level are also being taken on board, but taken on board jointly by both police and CPS areas. A lot more I could say, and a lot more detail I could provide, but happy to take questions if there's any time, but equally happy to take any email queries that anyone in the audience or online is interested in asking. Thank you very much, Irene.
That's wonderful. Thank you for such an informative presentation, Mick. And also thank you to the audience for watching this presentation. As Mick suggested, if you have any questions, please do contact Mick directly via email. Also, Mick, would you like to add anything else before we stop recording? Is there anything that we haven't covered and you would like to mention?
The one thing I touched on earlier was the fall in cases coming to us. I would really encourage everybody to report incidents of hate crime, even if they feel they're not terribly sure if it is a hate crime or not, but just if they have concerns that something just feels wrong and is affecting them or their friend or somebody they know, that the best answer is always to seek advice, whether it's online. Some very good agencies working in this field, but if it's serious, to report to the police to get advice. It's never acceptable to simply accept a hate crime of any kind, and disability hate crime is particularly pernicious. But I am concerned, I continue to be concerned about the fall in numbers coming forward. So if anything, more of an encouragement to everyone to seek out advice and to report hate crime where appropriate.
That's really, really important. Thank you again.
Everyone, so I'm with Josh Heppel today, who's a disability activist and campaigner, who also writes a lot about his experiences both academically and also in newspapers. So we're here today just to get Josh's perspectives on disability hate crime, and particularly where disability hate crime comes from, and what we can do about it to try and challenge it. So over to you, Josh. Where do you think that disability hate crime comes from?
I think it's important that all of us look at how we interact with everyone on a personal level.
I think it's important that we all look at how we interact with everyone on a personal level.
I think that the different people can be objectified and ostracized.
I think in general people could be objectified and ostracized.
I would never defend any type of hate crime.
I'd never defend any type of hate crime.
But I do think that we all have to take a look at how we interact with each other.
But I do think that we all need to take a look at how we interact with each other.
Lots of my work.
Lots of my work.
It's about sexual agency and autonomy.
It's about sexual agency and autonomy.
Disabled people are often desexualized.
Disabled people are often desexualized.
Searching for no promotion in of disinformation. Sexual objectification.
And I'm certainly not promoting any type of disability sexual objectification.
If we remove the capacity to fall in love,
But if we remove the capacity to fall in love,
we remove so much of human experience.
we remove so much of the human experience.
And can we be surprised that
Can we be surprised that
we're seen as easy vulnerable targets
we're seen as easy, vulnerable targets
of dyslexia or anxiety stop you interacting with people who might communicate differently?
do you let your own anxiety stop you from communicating with people that might communicate differently?
How does this play out wider in the community?
How does this play out in the wider community?
And do those right perpetuate its correct
And then do those who might perpetuate hate crime
return to the sense of othering
feed off this sense of othering?
and in my opinion, yes.
In my opinion, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So something that you briefly mentioned them, and I know it's something that you're interested in, is this kind of concept of vulnerability. How do you think that plays into our understanding of hate crime and how it might cause someone to be targeted by hate crime?
I think all of us are vulnerable to situations at different moments.
I think all of us are vulnerable in different situations and at different moments.
We have to acknowledge systematic discrimination.
We have to acknowledge systematic discrimination.
That some groups more vulnerable than others.
It does make some groups more vulnerable than others.
Again, language around vulnerability.
Again, perpetuating language around vulnerability needs to be done in a sensitive way.
I may be physically vulnerable,
I may be physically vulnerable,
but I also know how to write very well
but I also know how to write very well
and how to make formal complaints using my good use of language.
and how to make formal complaints using my good use of language.
And can raise many other ideas about vulnerability,
And that can raise many other ideas around vulnerability, such as income vulnerability.
If you feel that
If you now feel that
your job is in jeopardy,
your job is in jeopardy,
so again, I would be very sensitive
so again, I would be very sensitive
about adding labels of vulnerability
about adding labels of vulnerability
in any context.
in any context.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And so in terms of trying to challenge hate crime, to reduce hate crime towards disabled people, and reducing hate crime more generally, what would you suggest that we need to do, both as individuals, but also as a society, and as organisations more broadly?
Disabled people included more,
Make disabled people feel included more.
and they might not be as easily targeted.
And then they might not be as easily targeted.
No one can defend hate crime,
No one can defend a hate crime.
but if those people are watching and professionals interact with disabled people,
But if those people are watching how professionals interact with disabled people,
from my experience,
from my experience,
such as my doctor
such as with my doctors,
shouting
shouting
at my assistant,
at my assistant,
it's amazing. You can understand those noises.
it's amazing you can understand those noises.
That's where I feel my anger lies.
That's where I feel my anger lies.
I'm sorry for those very vulnerable perpetrators
I feel sorry for those very vulnerable perpetuators
of hate crime
of hate crime
who feel the need to work me,
who feel the need to mug me,
who probably have a terrible life themselves,
who probably have a terrible life themselves,
who probably have not been very well educated.
who probably have not been very well educated.
I'm sorry to all of you who probably think coming and it's the wrong direction.
I'm sorry to all of you who think I'm probably coming at this the wrong direction.
My own professors, social workers,
But my old,
and my own
but if my own professors, social workers,
doctors
doctors
interact with me such a horrendous way,
interact with me in such a horrendous way,
have so much freedom.
after having so much training,
I interact with disabled people
and interact with the disabled people every day,
while I was challenging perpetrators,
why are we challenging the actual perpetuators? Who are probably following that energy
of the professionals searching without their rights either.
of those professionals who certainly can't get it right either.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Josh. So that yes, we need to challenge individual people that are perpetrating hate crime, but we need to look kind of beyond those individual perpetrators and where these attitudes are coming from and where people are learning those attitudes from. Yeah, absolutely. And what in terms of the audience that we've got at the conference, what kind of key message do you maybe have about being able to respond to hate crime and being able to make ourselves more accountable to challenging it in our everyday lives?
I'm going to say something fairly simple.
I'm going to say something fairly similar.
I don't want to undermine the trauma of anyone who has had a very violent crime attack.
I don't want to undermine the trauma of anyone who's had a very violent hate crime attack.
I'm sorry for anyone who has.
And I'm sorry for anyone who has.
But if you want to meet someone like me,
But if you want to meet someone like me,
if you were to
meet someone like me,
would have the confidence to repeat myself,
would you have the confidence to ask me to repeat myself?
would you let your own anxiety prevent you
Or would you let your own anxiety prevent you
having a good, calm conversation
from having a good, calm conversation
when you interact with disabled for yourself.
When you interact with disabled people yourself,
And you treat them as respectfully as possible.
are you treating them as respectfully as possible?
Are you calm and confident?
Are you calm and confident?
My reaction to that question to my own social workers was academic.
My gut reaction to that question regarding my own social workers and old academics
Would certainly no.
would most certainly be no.
And it doesn't trickle down into people who are more vulnerable.
And then it trickles down to people who are more vulnerable,
Who feels the need to smoke and attack disabled
who
people.
feel the need to mug and attack disabled people.
We have created society
I feel like we've created a society
with those people are far more perceived as vulnerable, far more than need to be.
where those people are presumed as vulnerable far more than they need to be.
I feel it's a slightly new perspective.
I realise this is a slightly new perspective.
If I was there in person,
And if I was there in person,
some of you would be more than welcome
some of you would be more than welcome
to counter anything I've said.
to counter anything I've said.
But I just think this conversation needs to be said more.
But I do think this conversation needs to be had more.
And I'm sorry for offending anyone.
And I'm sorry if I've offended anyone.
Thank you. I think that it's a really good reminder that we need to check in with ourselves, and for everyone working in and around hate crime and disability hate crime, we need to make sure that we're constantly questioning our own beliefs and our own actions, and really holding ourselves accountable. I think that's a brilliant message. So I know that you'll be online on the day, Josh, so hopefully we can get some questions and some discussion going on the day as well. I think that'll be fantastic. But thank you for giving us the time and recording this video, and I'm sure it's going to spark some really interesting discussion and debate. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks.
Is entitled Hope for the Future, and including violence against women and girls. I'm really pleased to join three fantastic speakers in this panel. We start with Professor Mark Walters, who will talk about changing the law safeguarding victims of disability hate crime from the University of Sussex. We will then move on to Bethany Bay, who will talk about countering disability hate crime in the UK, thoughts for the future. And also, last but not least, Dr. Hannah Mason-Bish will talk about disabled women's experiences of unwanted touching and intersectional understanding from the University of Sussex. I will now hand over to Professor Mark Walters.
Thanks, Irene. Good afternoon, everyone. We can do better than that. Come on. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, that's nice. So this is what's referred to in conference jargon as the graveyard shift, where I need to try and re-engage everyone's minds and brains by talking over the next 20 minutes about the intricacies of hate crime legislation. Doesn't sound that engaging, but I'm going to do my best to make it as exciting as possible. Okay, so over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to outline what the law is with regards to addressing disability hate crime, what some of the issues are that limit the application of the law, And then what I refer to as the justice gap for disability hate crime. How many cases go into the system and then drop out of the system? And is it getting better or is it getting worse? And I'll look at data from 2016 when I first did this up until last year. We'll then have, if there's time, a little sort of critique or reflection on the Law Commission proposals to change the law to make it work better. And I will then say, that's not good enough. And here is my own recommendation on how the law needs to be changed, in particular for disability hate crime. Okay. So let's start off by looking at what is the law with regards to addressing disability hate crime. Now, there's a lot of text up there. You don't have to read that. That's for your reference at a later date. But we find the relevant provision under section 66 of the Sentencing Act 2020. That replaces, by the way, the old Criminal Justice Act 2003. I'm going to start off by saying what this provision doesn't do. What this provision doesn't do is create a specific criminal offence of disability hate crime. In law, there is no such thing, for example, as a disability aggravated assault, like there is for racially aggravated assault. That's a criminal offence. No such thing for disability aggravated offences. Okay. At trial, you do not have to admit or prove disability hostility when prosecuting a disability hate crime case. And upon conviction for a crime, say for an assault, that crime, if it is a disability hate crime, will not be labelled in law as a disability aggravated offence. And that's different for other types of hate crime, like racial or religious hate crime. Okay, so they're treated differently in law. After conviction, so we've got prosecution, we'll have the trial, there might be a conviction for a crime, then at sentencing, right over here, the judge can refer to this piece of legislation. Now, if the prosecution admits evidence of disability hostility and it's proved beyond reasonable doubt, the court must state that the offence is aggravated by hostility, and it must say what the sentence would have been without that aggravation. So this is what we refer to as the sentence uplift. How much extra is the court going to give the defendant, now the offender, for having committed a crime that's aggravated by disability hostility? Now, there are a number of problems that limit the application of this provision. The first thing to note is that disability hate crime is not included in the criminal law. Now, the criminal law, which deals with hate crime, is found under the Crime and Disorder Act 1998. Okay? No disability hostility within that particular piece of legislation. Now, there are 11 offences which are found under that particular piece of legislation. So assaults, public order offences, harassment, criminal damage. Okay? You can only prosecute those as hate crimes if they're racially or religiously aggravated. So disability, not in the criminal law, which means when the police investigate a hate crime, they don't necessarily have to collate evidence of hostility to put before the court for prosecution to prove the offence. And one might argue, therefore, that it's not taken as seriously as other types of hate crime. Now, even if we were to include disability under the Crime and Disorder Act, so that there's parity between different types of hate crime, it only covers 11 offences, and it doesn't cover sexual offences, and it doesn't cover property offences. Yet the CPS's own data suggests that almost 40% of disability hate crime cases involve sexual violence or property offences, theft, fraud, etc. So even if you include it in the criminal law under the CDA, 40% of disability hate crime cases won't be included within its remit. The third limitation, the way in which disability hate crime is evidenced in court is if the offender demonstrates disability hostility or is motivated by hostility. And as we've seen throughout this conference from the various presenters today, a lot of hate crime targeted towards disabled people doesn't necessarily manifest as what we might think of as hostility. It might be about contempt, it might be about bias, it might be about prejudice, it might be about targeting someone because of their disability. But when it gets to court and the jury says, is this hostility? Or the judge says, is this hostility? They go, no. These cases are about perceived vulnerability. That was someone taking advantage of that victim. That was someone taking advantage because they thought they were vulnerable. And the court says, no, it's not about hate, it's not about hostility, it's about vulnerability. And therefore the legislation is not applied. What happens is that the majority of disability hate crime is disappeared from the criminal justice system. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, there are lots of reasons, by the way, for the disappearing of disability hate crime. It's not just about the legal test, which I'm going to look at in a moment. There are multiple reasons, but the legal test, I believe, is a significant contributing factor of what I refer to as the justice gap for hate crime. The justice gap is the gap between the number of cases that come to the attention of the authorities and those that result in a conviction. And if we're thinking of justice for hate crime as the application of hate crime legislation, and a sentence uplift. So what number of cases drop out of the system without hate crime legislation being applied? Yep. Let's take a look. 2016 to 17. There was an estimated 52,000 disability hate crimes in that year. Over 7,000 cases were recorded by the police, resulting in 752 prosecutions by the CPS. That had resulted in 564 convictions. So the conviction rate's not bad. But look what happens when it gets to the sentencing stage and the judge says, yes, I'm going to aggravate that sentence. I'm going to give an uplift because of disability hostility. Just 24% of those cases resulting in the application of hate crime legislation for disability hate crime cases as they've been recorded. 133. So 52,000 hate crimes against disabled people, cautious estimate by the way, resulting in 133. Now that is a justice gap of 98.2%. In other words, 98.2% of disability hate crime cases that come to the attention of the police do not result in the application of hate crime legislation, which is the aim ultimately for hate crime legislation. Does it improve as we go along? So I did a report 2017, said, look at this big justice gap, we need to improve it. What was the impact of that? Did they improve things, do you think? Well, let's have a look. So 2019 to 2020, we have 8,000 recorded hate crimes. So the number of recorded disability hate crimes going up. That's good, by the way. It means more people coming forward. The police are getting better at recording. It's not good if there are more hate crimes against disabled people, of course, but we generally say that's a good thing. Oh dear, 360 prosecutions. That's massively down. 292 convictions, down. 93 cases with an uplift. It's 32%. Now, Mick in his recording earlier was saying, look, CPS is doing pretty good. Uplifts are going up, the percentage. What he failed to mention, sorry, Mick, if you're listening, I do love you. It's great. He's a great guy. Work well with him. But if you're not paying attention to the statistics, what that looks like is that the percentage of uplifts is going up. However, the number's coming down. So even though the percentage was lower 4 years ago, the actual number of cases resulting in an uplift has significantly decreased. Is everyone following that? Percentage is going up, but the actual number is going down. This isn't good. So 2020 to 2021, percentage is going up again, but we're now at 99.1% for a justice gap. The justice gap is increasing. It means fewer disability hate crime cases are coming to the attention of the CPS, fewer cases prosecuted, fewer convictions, fewer uplifts. It's getting worse. I'm not going to do well with my REF impact case study next time in terms of the research changing and benefiting society because it's getting worse. Deary me. Okay, so what has been the response? How am I doing for time? Good. Right. So the Law Commission was tasked with looking at how the law could be improved to deal with all types of hate crime, including, of course, disability hate crime. What have they recommended? What do I think about their recommendations? Well, first of all, they say disability should be included under the CDA. In other words, disability hostility should become a specific criminal offence for 11 criminal offences. Okay? Tick. We like that. Well, I like that because it means that disability hate crime is going to fall within the criminal law and it's going to be taken more seriously as a result. They say, look, we understand that this word hostility is problematic. So what we'll do is we'll add the word prejudice within the legal test. So if a crime is motivated by disability prejudice, that can now be prosecuted in court. What do I think about that? Well, I think it's a slight improvement. Okay, this word hostility in its literal interpretation is inhibitive of a myriad of types of disability hate crime. Will prejudice solve that issue? Maybe in some cases, if the prosecution can show, look, someone has been selected because of the offender's prejudice towards disabled people, rather than them being hostile towards them. I think it's unlikely to have much of an impact. The reason being is that the word motivation is maintained within that legal test, proving that someone is motivated by hatred or prejudice towards someone who's disabled is really, really, I'm going to say it again, really hard beyond reasonable doubt. In fact, when I interviewed 77 judges, prosecutors, and defence counsel, the majority of them had never come across a case where that had been successfully prosecuted. Yes, for the demonstration, it's easy if you use a slur or there's some kind of objective outward manifestation of hostility, you can prove that. But motivation is difficult to prove in court. That's why, generally speaking, the criminal law for most other offences don't use it. So hard to go into someone's mind and say, are you a racist? Is there evidence that you're a racist or that you're disablist? So the Law Commission's kind of said, oh, we'll change it a little bit. Will it make much difference? I'm not that confident. What about the sexual offences and property offences, which the CPS suggests make up almost 40% of disability hate crime cases? Should they be included under the criminal law? The Law Commission says no. Why? Well, sexual offences are really difficult to prove anyway. They have a really low conviction rate. So if you add on top of that some kind of aggravation that you've got to prove at trial, then it might result in even fewer sexual offences being successfully prosecuted and convicted. So for practical reasons, no. Property offences, they say, there's just not enough evidence that it's an issue. Well, apart from the CPS data and quite a lot of research suggesting it is, they think it's not a big enough issue to change the criminal law, and they tend to take a cautious approach. You don't change the criminal law. It's quite serious to change the criminal law unless there really is evidence that there is a need to do it. I suggest there is. They also agree that this is a bad move from the Law Commission. So thank you. Okay, what needs to be done? Well, first of all, I do think sexual offences and property offences should be included under the CDA, but I also think that there needs to be a new legal test to prove hate crime, and in particular, disability hate crime. We need to move away from a motivation of hostility test. It doesn't work. And instead, employ what I refer to, or what is generally referred to, as a by reason test. That would mean that the prosecution can prove a disability hate crime if they can show that the offender, the defendant, if it's not convicted yet, the defendant committed the crime by reason of the perceived victim's disability. So we're not looking at whether they are disablest, whether their intention is that they don't like disabled people, only that they selected the victim because of their disability. Yep. And we can refer to causation tests here in proving that in court. So if, for example, you can show that it is a significant and substantial reason for committing the offence, the person's disability, that would fall within the ambit of the legislation. I think this is a much more inclusive test. It's used in the majority of jurisdictions globally. I've just reviewed over 190 legal jurisdictions globally. The majority use what's called a by reason test. I believe that this could work in this country with additional training and with the policy domain being as sophisticated it is here, comparatively speaking to other countries, that it could work. And in particular, it would work better for disability hate crime cases. Okay, so just to finish, unless we reframe the way we criminalise hate in this country, especially for disability hate crime, so that we include crimes that are targeted against already marginalised groups, we will remain attached to a criminal justice system and a policy domain that views hate crime as being linked to intense emotions of hatred, hostility, and loathing. And that will leave disability hate crime out of the courtroom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Beth, are you happy to come? That's great.
Do you want, Beth, do you want my clip there? I'll leave it there in case Hannah wants it.
Thank you, Beth.
I promise I'm not checking my phone. I'm just keeping an eye on the time if I look down there, not reading my text messages. Thank you very much. So my name is Beth Nevay. I'm from Disability Rights UK. For those of you who might not know, Disability Rights UK is first and foremost a disabled people's organisation. So we are led by disabled people. Most of the staff that work for us are disabled people, but also we work a lot with other local DPOs, other individuals who have that lived experience of disability. What is really core in everything that we do is that all of the campaigning work that we're doing is informed by that lived experience of disability. Our vision, as it were, is that disabled people have equal access to society as non-disabled people, which I'm sure all of us know here today is not the case, unfortunately, in a variety of ways. We are also a registered charity, and our work ranges from supporting individuals with things like a disabled students helpline, but also to the wider policy and campaigns work. I'm a policy and campaigns officer for Disability Rights UK, and one of the areas that I am looking at the moment is hate crime. I like to think that my work is quite varied. 2 days ago, I was at Westminster Abbey and Grenfell Tower, attending a Grenfell memorial service for the 5-year anniversary. Both Prince William and Kate Middleton were there, as well as Stormzy. I'll let each of you decide which of those is more exciting. I think I probably have an idea. But although the policy might vary, what is absolutely consistent in everything that we see is that disabled people are failed at every single step of the way, in every aspect of society, in every policy area, but also at every step of that, which I think has been clear today from lots of the things that we've heard. But two things I just really want to pull out from the charter that we have, two quotes from victims very kindly provided by David and his research. The first one is, no one is reporting it because that's what you get your whole life and you don't know any different. And the second one is, what's the point of reporting this? Because no one will take it seriously. And I think that sums it up, doesn't it? You know, when I say that my week has been varied, I've gone from fire safety and housing to hate crime. What I've gone from is campaigning where the government have refused evacuation plans for disabled people, telling them to stay put in a house that is burning down, to a conference of disability hate crime, where disability hate crime is not even a criminal offence. And it's 2022. I mean, it's all a bit ridiculous. And I think to say that disability hate crime is at the bottom of people's agendas, as many people have said today, I would go as far to say that it's not on the agenda. Disability is so rarely on the agenda. And I think what these two quotes highlight as well is two really important things, which I think were key reasons that inspired us to look at the charter, which I do hope as well, you should have all been emailed the charter. Good, that's good to know. So I won't read through it page by page, you can peruse that on your own. But kind of two of the driving factors behind this was that, number one, you don't know any different. Why would you report it? The fact that we have normalized the way, not only the way that disabled people can't access so many things in society, the way that they are excluded, but also the things they have to deal with throughout life, the things they have to take from people, the way that we think it's okay to treat disabled people, the way that they face the animosity that they do daily. And, you know, hate crime ruins lives. We've touched on that today. We've touched on as well that everyday hate, the fact that this isn't always high-level crimes. This is people who feel like they can't leave their house, who feel like they need to change their route to wherever they're going. And for those that have got past the point of actually thinking, no, I should challenge this, this maybe isn't okay, that it takes so long to even get to that point. That is where we value disabled people in society. But for that minority that think, no, I'm going to challenge this, they then say, no one will take it seriously, because that's what they face. They face so many more barriers when they actually go and report. I think what highlights this best is a stat that Neil did touch on briefly earlier, but I think hearing it over kind of a matter of years really shows how staggering this is. So the Home Office reported that between 2015/16 to 2020 to 2021, disability hate crimes recorded by police rose by 173.5%. In the same time, and that's of course knowing that many people aren't reporting anyway, but just under nearly 200% of a rise. In the same time period, the number of cases sent to CPS fell by 66.7%, which is staggering when we consider this is the tip of the iceberg as well. I dread to think what the reality of those numbers actually are. So we know that there is not even a lack of action when it comes to disability, a lack of noticing in the first place, a lack of even taking any awareness that this is happening and that this is not okay. So we need to remember when we're talking about action and the urgency of that action as well, the urgency in speaking out, is how much further behind we already are. We are already catching up. We are already catching up in terms of being taken seriously and being able to access these services. But in, as I say, even in it being a criminal offence, and in all of these things, we are behind, and we will face more barriers along our journey as we try to, catch up with where we should be. I will say there is some positivity here, not to be all doom and gloom. There is some wider context that can help us. Very often, I think you can feel very alone when trying to campaign. You can feel that no one is listening to you, no one is there to help you with that action. There are, although not always the most effective, there are ways to engage in policy and being aware of, the things that are going on as well that you can make use of. So we do know that last year the Law Commission published a report, and one of their recommendations was to make disability hate crime a criminal offence. So we have that on side. We're not the only people that are saying this. We have, those in the positions of power that are also agreeing with us. What needs to happen, though, is for the legislation makers, those that also have the power, to listen to that, for that not to get lost in a recommendation, in a report on a shelf somewhere, for us to really use the tools and things that we already have written by the experts, by the ones that have their voice heard more than us, and say, look, if you're not going to listen to me, point to that. They have said this. Let's push this. We also know that the hate crime plan from the government is due very soon. Say very soon. The SEND review is due. I don't know how long ago, and it's only recently come out, so I'm not sure when that will be, but it is due. So that's coming as well. These things often come with consultation periods and times to engage with that as well. And we as well hope that not only that you will help us and engage with us in the work that we're doing, but that hopefully in the charter that we've made, that this is also a helpful tool for you to push that message, to be active, to have those constructive and productive conversations wherever you might be, whether that is with your employer, whether that is a group that you're working with, if you're working in an institution, whether it's to raise awareness there, that this will be helpful for you in having more direction with that conversation, because so many of you as well sat here today are doing such important work that really is having an impact. I don't want you to think by looking at the dismal context of this that you're not having an impact, because you are, and that's important. But hopefully, as David has touched on so many times today, this is about collaboration. This is about working together. And this, as you'll see from the email, this is a draft copy of the charter. This is very much flexible. This is something that we want your input with. We want this to be a continual process to make sure that it is the most helpful resource it can be, and that it is the most realistic interpretation from victims in terms of what they say is needed. But we really hope that you will take this, and as my email is on the screen, you're welcome to talk to me afterwards as well, in making sure that we're pushing forward with this. Our main areas that we've really wanted to focus on is that collaboration, that engagement, making sure it's disabled led, making sure it is informed by the experiences of victims. But outside of that, everyone has an input to give. If you are working in policy, if you are working in one of these institutions, maybe you don't have a personal experience of these things, but you can also, be an ally in terms of what policies can help us, how can, what tools are there to help us, engage with these processes more. The main things that have come up for us is the fact that there needs to be clear reporting routes, that it needs to not only be clear itself, a very simple, easy process to work through, but also people need to be challenged, but then where to go with that. That once they've gone there, once they've gone and they've reported, that there needs to be that consistent and effective support as well, not only consistency in terms of from reporting to hopefully past successful prosecution, but also that is accessible, that is actually helpful to the victim, and also staff training, making sure that those who, not only just those who are public facing, those in policy, these are, as Neil mentioned earlier, these are systemic issues. These are not kind of unfortunate mistakes that happen. These are systemic societal injustices, And when we are working against trying to challenge these, we're not working with neutral structures. We're working with things, ideas, behaviours that have been institutionalised, and that takes a long time to tackle those things. But it needs to be done. And also we can change the pattern. Although these institutions, do have lots of institutionalized ableism within them, although society has a lot of entrenched ableism generally, we also can change that pattern of, okay, a victim has gone to report, they have had an awful experience, they have not been taken seriously, they go away and never come back and continue to normalize that abuse that they have faced. Actually, if we change that experience for one person, we are beginning to change that pattern. It's not a perfect system that pattern is happening in, and changing that to a much better system is going to take a very long time. But the fact that we have a far from perfect system, I mean, that seems not strong enough. An institutionally ableist system, that shouldn't be a reason not to have action here, not to still challenge this, not to try and change the individual patterns of, as more people have positive experiences, more people will want to report. The staff members that will be working with victims longer will have a better understanding of what was successful last time. This is something that can be done, and will be done. I'm sure, like all of you here today, all of you online, care enough about this that you want to do something about it. And with all of those people combined, if we can unify our voice, which hopefully we're trying to help with by providing a tool that can bring a voice together, can bring us together, so we're saying similar things, and hopefully have an even bigger impact by unifying our voice. But also remembering while we're doing this that disability, although often not on the agenda at all, is everybody's issue. That's often something that is really not acknowledged enough. Aside from the ethics of everyone should care about this, there is also the fact, of course, that people with disabilities, to join that marginalised, minority group, it's one of the few that actually anyone can join throughout their life. Any of us at any point can become disabled. Any of us, most of us probably will, if not already, become disabled with age. Disability touches all of our lives, and yet it is, as I say, not even deprioritised, but often just not even seen in any way. But I mean, I can see you all here today, and although I can't see you online, I know there are many of you. And don't undermine that. Don't undermine the power that you have as individuals, and how I really hope that we can help you as well in coming together and really raising that voice and making this an issue. As Neil said earlier, you have to make a lot of noise, you have to make this an issue to then actually be able to tackle the issue. And I hope that we can do that together.
What an inspirational talk. Thank you so much. We'll now hand over to Hannah.
Is it just that to do the slides? I don't think the slides, just choose that. Choose that?
Yeah.
Okay. Just do my papers. Okay, what an amazing speech to follow and to finish. No pressure. Yeah, it's a shame that I'm on last, really, because I'm not about to cheer you up. But I am finishing with a lot of voices of disabled women who kindly took part in my project, and I suppose that is sort of an apt way to finish, to hear the voices of people who experience this range of abuse. And so I'm going to be talking about disabled women's experiences of unwanted touching and looking at it from an intersectional point of view. My journey with hate crime is that I've been studying it, researching it for probably 20 years. Scary to say that out loud, but yes, 20 years it is. And I started looking at disability, and then over the years also looked at gender. And I was really interested in how women and disabled people were often seen as problematic categories for hate crime, that they were difficult, there was too much of it, it was complicated, but also that then it meant they were often excluded from policy, but mainly from practice. So the sort of journey for me to get to this project has been looking at these two groups somewhat separately, and then of course it's come together. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to start by talking about a poem by Maria Palacios, which was written in 2017, and which really sums up some of the themes that I'm going to be talking about. So what she said was, if men were to catcall disabled women, I imagine it would be like the world has flipped upside down. Disabled women were suddenly found to be sexy, and just passing by would mean being exposed to unwanted shit. Instead, we get assaulted by words of pity and fear while pretending we're not really here, or wishing we did not exist. We get assaulted by ableism or inspiration porn, like God bless you, how amazing you are, for wanting to keep loving life. I'm so sorry, bless your heart, I'll pray for you to heal, may I lay hands on you in the name of the Lord. So what she's talking about there, of course, is how bodies are read in public spaces as disabled. That leads to assumptions of frailty, of immobility, of vulnerability, sometimes of giftedness, of inspiration, but it all leads to a reaction towards the disabled person. And so this kind of idea is what inspired what I'm going to talk about. And probably like a lot of the presentations, I'll say, yeah, I'm going to use quotations from participants that are really hard hitting and use really uncomfortable and challenging language. But it's important because they're the words of the participants, so I'm not going to edit what they've told me. So I'll just preface that by saying that now. Okay, and as well as my own interest in the area, it became quite clear that disabled women particularly were missing from a lot of discourse that's been going on in the last 5 or 10 years. So the Me Too movement, of course, which has come to define our more recent understandings of sexual violence and assault, disabled women have really been missing from the Me Too discourse. Lots of campaigners have talked about how 4 out of 5 disabled women will experience sexual violence or assault in their lifetime. And we know that in the UK, women with a disability or long-term illness are twice as likely to experience sexual assault. And yet the Me Too movement has often excluded them from any discussion whatsoever. It's almost like they don't exist. And that's partly because of assumptions around disabled women lacking desirability as being asexual. And a lot of our framing of it, of course, has been around that sort of desirability factors, I suppose, if you want to call it that. But disabled women have also been missing from the hate crime narrative. I think it's probably fair to say that hate crime has not been great at dealing with intersectionality or complicated victims, as they might be called. And so disability and gender has been the lost intersection, really. And so the experiences of disabled women have gone missing there as well. And we've seen that more recently because in Nottinghamshire, where they did the pilot on misogyny around hate crime, they focused a lot on street harassment, so the harassment of women in public spaces. But one of the sort of gentle critiques you could make of that is that what they were looking at is women like me, so white, middle class, straight, non-disabled women, and how we might be experiencing street harassment. But as the quote up there says from Joanne Wally, she wrote a piece, Nobody Catcalls the Woman in the Wheelchair. She says that there's an assumption that street harassment is ubiquitous, that we all experience it, but that reinforces ableist ideas of womanhood because it's only a given if your body is seen by the patriarchy as a sexual object. So again, disabled women are excluded. But what we do know is that disabled women experience hostility on the streets, and my research was around the kind of public sphere, and that is framed around pity, help and hate. And it's those first two, really, I suppose, that became key in my research. So the impaired body, as some of the theorists have talked about, and the fragility of the body is something in need of help or of care, that disabled people will experience being infantilized when they're in public spaces, people talking to their carers, moving them around, touching their wheelchair or their mobility aid. And that sends the message that they have no place in public, that there needs to be some kind of intervention, that they might be an inconvenience, that they disrupt public space. They require adaptations which are awkward, which are expensive, which are difficult. And so the disabled body is seen as out of place
It's sometimes called ableist anxiety. So people feeling anxious, they need to do something when there's a disabled person in public. And I'll come on to what some of those actions are. And of course, there's been a lack of research in this area. There's been quite a lot around forced intimacy in care settings, but not a lot about how it is framed in public. There's been a fair amount of research now on access issues, which I've just alluded to, and also violence against women literature. There's been some there, but really not kind of bringing together these different themes. And then, as I said, my own interest in this area coalesced with meeting an amazing campaigner called Amy Kavanagh. She's a visually impaired activist, and she started a campaign online called Just Ask, Don't Grab, because she found when she was out in public, people would touch her all the time. At that particular time, she was a white cane user. She's now has a guide dog. And she talks a lot about the different experiences she's had since changing mobility aid in that sense. But I'll just read a little bit about what she said about her campaign. She said, "I've been dragged across roads, pulled out of train carriages, pushed around shops without being asked if I wanted assistance. These experiences are distressing, they're disorientating. Occasionally they cause me physical harm. And whenever I share a story of being pulled into moving traffic or pushed in the wrong direction, people say, they had good intentions, they were only trying to help." So she created the the campaign, Just Ask, Don't Grab, to channel the good intentions into positive action, and to talk to the public and educate them, have that educative function. But she also wanted to talk about the mental and physical impacts on disabled people who experience that daily unwanted touching. And what she also talks about is the emotion work that disabled women in particular are expected to undertake in managing members of the public. So if someone says, I was only trying to help, there's an expected reaction of gratefulness on the part of the disabled person. But she talks about, similarly to hate crime, it has a daily grinding impact on her life, not knowing what interactions are going to happen, whether it will be violence, whether it will be comments, whether it will be touching. And that her consent is seen as invalid or not even requested at any given time. So what we did quickly was we asked people just to share their stories. We set up a really simple WordPress site where people could send in their stories via email or just upload them, and then we just uploaded the stories to share as a sort of a living document, as it were, of people's experiences. We had about 60, 70 responses just in the first few weeks of people talking about what they experienced. So I won't go through kind of all the aims of the project, but essentially what we wanted to do was to gather the experiences of unwanted touching, the impact it had on people's freedom of movement, the ability for disabled women to enjoy everyday life, and to look more deeply at how disability and gender were operating together in their experiences. So I'll now share some of those experiences with you. The overwhelming theme that came out is that people said this is just one example. So there's a huge range of examples they could share, because every day was filled with unexpected violations, as it was described. As Danielle says in the quote here, this sort of thing has happened so many times I barely register it anymore. So many of them just blur into one. Examples included being spat on, asked personal intrusive questions, being shouted at, being leant on, being pushed, being tipped out of wheelchairs, having their guide dog or their white cane damaged, being forced into corners, being sexually assaulted, being grabbed aggressively. The list goes on. Huge list of behaviours. One participant said, almost every time I leave my apartment, at least one person will try to touch me without my consent, to move me wherever they think I should go. When it happens, I'm threatened, humiliated, I'm furious. I have a tendency to freeze in these situations, but I always feel worse afterwards, like I should have stood up for myself. So I'm working on being prepared to snap at people who put their hands on me. So the important thing to note here as well is this happens in the context of wider daily interactions. So being patronised and talked over or talked down to, having access needs questioned or not available, parking spaces, things like that, or forced intimacy in care settings, which is also happening at the same time. And participants talked about mobility aids a lot and how mobility aids gave freedom, but also made them visible as disabled people. And that's what Amy talked to me about in terms of visual impairment. And once she became visibly visually impaired, that's when it started to happen. Yasmin, who I'm just going to read from here, who's a wheelchair user. She was a wheelchair user for 12 years at that point. She says, it's really tiring. I find dealing with people harder than the disability itself. I seem to have got over it, but it seems like other people find disability so confronting, they need to react in some way or just make some sort of comment. Sometimes it's things like, oh, you should have a license for that, or don't drink and drive. But she said, I just find it boring because I've heard it 400 times or more. The quote up here from Melissa also sums some of this up. So almost every time I leave the house, at least one person tries to touch me. So constantly happening. The other interesting theme was this idea of the helping hand. So Amy, who I quoted from earlier, talked about how people said, I was only trying to help. So this idea of help is quite key to what people talked about. So people's response would be to say they're being helpful, but it never happened in terms of offering help. The help came in physical form, in a forceful physical form, and then the person would say in a defensive mode, I was only trying to help. But of course, the recipient of the help doesn't know the intentions of the person doing it. So as one participant says here, it's horrible not knowing if someone's genuinely wanting to help or if they're just exploiting my vulnerability and that excuse of helping to manhandle me. And so Amy and I talked a lot about how she would have this forced help, and then the person helping her would then grope her or sexually assault her as part of this help. Another quote here from a woman called Denise, who talks about how people assume she's lost, that she's got mobility issues, ask her questions, grab her hand, forcing her to put her freedom pass down on the bus or the train. If she takes even more than a second to get through a doorway in her wheelchair, then people suddenly push her because they can't stand waiting for more than a moment. But we did find quite a lot of people talked about gender in terms of the perpetrators, if you want to use that word, that it was largely men they talked about, but also women, and particularly middle-aged women, who might be defensive in terms of saying they were trying to help. But this became described as an ableist anxiety, where a middle-aged woman would panic and try and help, but do it in a kind of difficult, complicated way. So people talked again about being grabbed and pushed in that situation. And I mentioned just now about Amy and the kind of the sexual assault, and unfortunately that did come across quite a lot from our participants. So Genevieve, who's quoted here, says a ramp agent at my home airport refused to acknowledge I had declined his assistance, saying no each time. I asked him to stop pushing me. He pushed me so quickly he hit the edge of the ramp and dumped me out of my chair. He groped both of my breasts and then walked away. When I complained to the airline, they said he knew I was struggling and he was only trying to help. So the claims of being helpful are kind of disproven a bit by people talking about how things escalated. So another common theme was that people said when they did challenge someone or said, no, can you not do that? Can you not touch me or whatever? It would escalate and become quite aggressive. So the response from the grabber is generally one of defensiveness and usually passive aggression along the lines of I was only trying to help. They very rarely apologise for their misjudgment. I've never been legitimately grabbed, i.e. in order to prevent an accident, is what Denise says. So lots of instances of people finding this escalation in terms of the behaviour that they experienced. A couple more themes to pull out. One was around being silenced and feeling silenced. I said at the outset that there's often not a request for consent. So can I help you is not the offering, it's the hands come first and then a discussion around consent. Is that people surrounding the members of the public not intervening, not doing anything when they're seeing this happen. So participants talked about people looking away, looking the other way, being aware that they knew something was going on but not intervening and not offering kind of genuine assistance. So bystanders just watching or reinforcing what was happening by doing nothing. And this strange position of being sort of hyper visible but also completely invisible, or they're physically visible but their emotions are invisible. So no one kind of caring about their feelings or their reactions. And this quote really sums some of it up from Denisha, who said, "I often feel that I'm infantilized as a disabled woman. There's a perception that I'm unable to judge situations for myself, that my body is somehow public property, and I should just be grateful for having complete strangers pour at me. I'm frustrated at how often my words go unheard. I feel robbed of my agency and independence." So having very real impacts there on her sense of self. And the impacts are things we've talked about already, and certainly what Leah talked about this morning, around how that impacts on disabled women's experiences of everyday life. And some of it is that they feel they're being put in serious danger. So we're talking sometimes here about people being pushed and pulled off of trains, pushed across the road, obviously sexually assaulted as well, and people interfering with their mobility aid so that the mobility aid then breaks, or they're being tipped out of a wheelchair. So then, of course, that has a serious impact as well. And so they might develop strategies to deal with it. I talked to Amy about this, and one thing she does is make a really strange noise. She said, because if I say no, or can you not do that, nobody hears. But if she just makes a squeal or some kind of grunt, suddenly it sort of interrupts the flow of what's happening. So some of the participants develop different strategies to deal with it outside of just saying no, because no was something that was not heard. So they sort of said things about developing different strategies. In terms of serious danger, as I mentioned, mobility aids, but participants also talked about the range of impairments they might have. One, Lucy, talked about having allodynia, and she describes this as her nervous system being faulty. She said it sends a pain signal instead of a touch signal. So even the lightest touch feels like I've been punched, hit with a sledgehammer, tasered or shot. The pain is like a lightning bolt, and it can make my muscles go into agonizing spasms. If I'm standing, it can drop me to the ground. Denise says, I was being escorted by a member of London Underground staff on the platform. He asked me to wait at the platform entrance. A man behind, who couldn't wait for the train, grabbed the tops of both my arms and said, I just want to get on the train, and forced me out of the way. I thought I was being pushed under the train. I screamed and pulled free and was left with severe bruising. So the impacts can be very serious in that sense. But another impact is that it leads to a squashing of personality or a living of a smaller life. And that's something that Leah as well mentioned this morning, of living a smaller existence and not participating fully in everyday life, and stay indoors. And so participants expressed their frustration at maybe receiving a different mobility aid that they'd waited for, that they'd had to pay for and just got used to using. And then when they went out in public, they suddenly became very visible and subject to increasing forms of hate and hostility, and this non-consensual touching. So staying indoors and living this small life was something that came out quite clearly. And Alyssa sums it up really well with this really sad quote. She says, I'll never forget the realization that I can expect everyone to laugh at me and no one to support me when I'm harassed in public. There's nothing I can do to force people to see me as a human being and respect my boundaries. It is hell. Okay, so just to finish off, I think kind of the important things that came out of the project were the need to centre agency, consent and dignity in our understanding. So listening to the agency of the disabled person, letting them have the freedom to do what they want without interaction. This idea of ableist intrusions, that the strangers are intruding upon people moving around in public space, which is not necessary. Asking for consent and listening to the response, as well as treating people with dignity and as human beings. And that there's a real connection between disability and gender, certainly in terms of what I found, although the next kind of stage of the project is to include men in the next stage of the findings. But the women who participated couldn't separate their disability and their gender. They felt they very much lived as disabled women, and that really defined their experiences. So hopefully sharing their experiences, as we have done, has this sort of educative function. And hopefully you'll see Amy, she's often on TV and doing various media things to raise awareness for this research that we've done and she continues to do. And I wanted just to say a little bit about COVID, because I followed up with a few participants, and because a lot of the data was gathered before COVID, and then I followed up with some interviews after, and the participants felt that they were even more annoyed that suddenly everyone became aware of social distancing, don't touch people, and suddenly everyone understood what that meant, but when they were voicing it, nobody could make sense of what they were talking about, but they felt that everything would go back to as it was before, and that's exactly what's happened. So people are less tolerant of them. So because the redesign of our movements have been governed by ableist principles. So if you think about social distancing and keeping distances apart, people are being more intolerant towards them if they're visually impaired and they can't distance or can't follow arrows in a shop, or various things, wearing masks and the like. And the messages from government around, you know, if you're vulnerable, just sort of stay at home rather than go out in public, rather than impinging on the lives of able-bodied people anymore. So I think those kind of troubling messages are really key. So yeah, I said it wasn't the cheeriest, but hopefully we can start to educate people and to capture the people who can be captured by highlighting some of these stories. So yeah, I'll finish there.
But can we give a round of applause to our wonderful speakers, Beth, Mark and Hannah? I think we're coming to the end now, and we'll conclude with some very brief reflections.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I think the major reflection is thank you. I know there are a couple of people who are disappointed, didn't ask follow-up questions. We were trying to bring in some new voices, so I apologise for that. It's my fault. Blame me if you're quick enough, because I'll be out the door soon. But really, honestly, thank you so much. Our speakers and sharing their knowledge, you sharing your time, our co-organisers sharing their knowledge, time, effort, energy, things I don't always have. Thank you for making a difference. Thank you for the fantastic IT team who have put this out across the globe and have interrupted questions from places across the globe about connectivity issues, and they're doing all this in the background, but now it's in the foreground. So thank you very much to you. I'm sure there'll be a pay rise. There's an enormous amount of effort, as I started the conference by saying, that has gone into making it possible. And that effort was mainly shared by a team of people that linger in the background, but their professionalism is often unspoken, but it's been fully recognised today. Laura, Wilma and your colleagues, thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you to all the people who helped to fund us. Unfortunately, there's no chance of getting any of your money back, so don't even bother. But it's been a momentous occasion. I hope it's one of several others we can do to raise issues into the public light. I'd ask my colleagues if they wanted to say anything else.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to also say thank you to the British Society of Criminology for all the support, the University of Leicester staff, colleagues, also the committee. We've been working really hard behind the scenes, but I think the driving force behind the conference is David. So a big round of applause for David, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, David approached me a couple of years ago and then COVID happened, and I think this is just all such a reflection of all of David's hard work and experience. The talks from today have been recorded, so we'll be able to share them afterwards. But yeah, just thank you everyone for coming. I hope you all get home safely, and hopefully we'll see faces again, you know, maybe next year.
And can we say thank you to everyone online?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.